Today we're going to talk about China. And in the West anyway, the first indication that they knew of China, or what they knew most about it, came from this man, Marco Polo, who was a merchant, a traveler from Italy. And he goes to China during the time of Mongol rule. The Mongols ruled China at that time. This is around 1275 when Marco Polo visits there. He writes this up, and this becomes the impression that people have of China in the West, in Europe, for many, many years. The Mongol rule ends in China in 1368 with a peasant rebellion. And this will bring about the change of a regime. Now, what's interesting about this period of Marco Polo, I'll just put a map up here that briefly shows his journey, journeying, as you can see, from Venice in Italy and making his way overland, first to China, and then he'll have some trips through China all the way down towards Thailand. And then he will actually take the route back, which is by sea. So his travels actually illustrate to us both the land routes and the sea routes that are there. So I think that's important to know, because China, for most of its history, stays rather isolated, and people have to come to them to get the goods that they want. And primarily they want tea and porcelains, China, from China, and that sort of thing. And the Chinese aren't that interested in most of the Western products because they're pretty self-sufficient. Well, at any rate, we want to sort of begin our survey here with the Ming Dynasty after that introduction. The Ming Dynasty, as you can see, lasts almost 300 years, 1369 to 1364. This is the founder, Zhu Yuanzhang. Ming Dynasty means bright, the bright dynasty. And they expand the control of China. You know, when China is powerful, they expand, and they expanded into Southeast Asia. And this is a time of growth in China, growth in their population, growth in their trade. And they did something in this period that they seldom did. In fact, this is unusual, very unusual, that the Chinese actually went with ships, their ships, and headed out into the Indian Ocean and all the way to the east coast of Africa, taking Chinese goods and initiating trade. Most of the time, for most of their history, they've been fairly isolated. People would have to come to them to get the goods. But in this case, during this period, for a while, they actually conducted trade. But that will end in 1433. So you can see it doesn't last that long, because it was quite controversial, and then people were fighting. There was a lot of infighting as to who would profit, who would control the trade. And we also see that some of the overland trade began to decline because of this. And so they sort of revert back to their more isolationist practice. Here is a map of the Ming Empire. Most of the people in China, in ancient times and in modern times, and during this period, have lived, let's say, within about 100 to 200 miles from the coast. China is actually quite large. If you include Tibet like it is today, they would be about the same size as the United States in land. And you see the main rivers that are here. You see the Yangtze River, and to the north, the Huahang, or the Yellow River. These are the main crops are grown in the south, the main population's a bit to the north. Here you see Beijing, for example. All right, that's a bit of the geography. Also note that the Korean Peninsula is nearby, and to the south, they can enter into Southeast Asia, especially into Vietnam. So the areas in which when they expand, they will come to have influence and control will be Vietnam, the Korean Peninsula, Tibet, and at times up here in Mongolia. Well, things begin to change for the Chinese as far as their isolation sort of status in 1514 when the Portuguese arrive. The Portuguese, of course, have been looking for spices. They wanted to control the spice trade. But, of course, once they made their way into Southeast Asia, they realized the proximity of China. They wanted to go there to get things like silks and porcelains. And so they arrive in Macau, and they occupy the city of Macau. The picture on the top here is showing Macau, I'd say probably around 1880 or something, before 1900. And down below, this is a more modern picture. So it is a thriving port, much like Hong Kong. Macau has been influenced by the Portuguese very early on. And so they're the ones that will then become the conduit of trade between China and Europe, and also the Portuguese will eventually land sort of accidentally in Japan and begin trade with China and Japan as well. Meanwhile, the Spanish were still in the Philippines, and they were trading with China at this time as well. So here we see what happens. So, you know, one of the things that happens when Europeans show up in different parts of the world, some people call it the 3 M's. First are merchants, that's the first M, merchants. Secondly, the missionaries. And third M would be the military. And it kind of comes in that order. The merchants get there first to do trade. Once people hear about it and hear it's the, you know, they've been there, then missionaries usually pretty quickly want to go to the area and try to evangelize and so forth. Then that ultimately will lead in most cases into conflict, and then that's when the military would come to protect or more control the area and keep it stable. Now, most of the missionaries in this part of the world are getting there from Portuguese and Spanish, so therefore it's Roman Catholic, and most of the missionaries are Jesuits, which is an order of monks. So the Jesuits in China, it's interesting. Here's a drawing of the earliest one, Mateo Rica, 1552 to 1610. They had to get the Chinese interested in what they were doing. They were sort of naturally suspicious of Westerners. So you see what Rica here does. He begins to dress in Chinese garb. He looks, you know, sort of Chinese. He grows a beard. He wears the clothes. He learns the language as well. But he will also use Western inventions, which he brings with him, that will gather their interest. Things like eyeglasses, mechanical clocks, things like this, which the Chinese had not seen before. And this sort of gathered their interest. They would come to see that, and then it sort of open a door. But he learned the Chinese language, which is a very difficult language, and adopted much of their customs. Now, one of the things he did will prove to be controversial is, of course, the teachings of Confucius were very important in China. And he had studied the writings, the teachings of Confucius, and he would try to draw parallels between the teachings of Confucius and the teachings of Christ. And he would promote Christian ideas this way. But later on, we're going to see some people say they think perhaps he drew too heavily upon this. He didn't draw a distinction between it. So he does learn the language, adopt the dress, promote Christian ideas with inventions and this connection with Confucius. We also see an exchange of ideas, exchange of things. This always happens when cultures meet. There will be a cultural exchange. It's inevitable. It will happen. And normally, not always, but it can come to the benefit. In this case, for example, eyeglasses. They did not have eyeglasses in China. They did have them in Europe. And so obviously, if you need eyeglasses, you would understand why someone would be attracted to that invention. Well, the Ming begin to have problems. What are their problems? There's a famine. There's a failing economy. Because of this, they make an alliance with the Manchus, who are in the northeast of China, northeast of the Great Wall that is pictured up here in the upper right corner. But epidemic comes, disease comes, famine comes. These things tend to come together. One sort of leads to the other. They reinforce each other. If there's not enough food, then people get weak and they get sick. If people are sick, they don't have the energy to plant the crops and take care of things. But eventually this will lead to a peasants' revolt, led by the guy on the coin here in the bottom right, Li Zichen. Li Zichen, 1604 to 1651, was some called a disgruntled postal worker. He was dismissed from his job, and he becomes a kind of hero to the communist Chinese, who see him as a peasant who rose up against the powers and led the people in a rebellion or revolt. So he is well remembered, as you see on this coin, from China. So this will bring an end to the Ming dynasty, and they had problems on all fronts. As you can see to the north, they have the Mongols, the Jurgens. They have pirates coming from the south, and disease and famine and so forth. So China is hitting a hard time here. This peasant rebellion, they will go into the main city here, Beijing. This is where the emperor lives. Beijing, of course, the city of Beijing is a very large city. But inside of it is another city, the imperial city. This is the place where the emperor would live. But the imperial city also had within it another city called the Forbidden City. So in other words, the emperor could be in the city of Beijing, would be quite isolated from the city because he lived in the city, but in a city within the city, but actually in a city within the city within the city. Because the Forbidden City, no one was allowed in there except by personal invitation of the emperor. That didn't happen very often. The imperial city, you could only get in there if you had some official business. So as the revolt spreads, and by 1644 they take Beijing, and the crowds, the people, the peasants are forcing their way into the imperial city. Soon they'd be forcing their way into the Forbidden City, the residence of the emperor. He, in fact, hanged himself in his garden in the palace to avoid being humiliated or tortured or whatever by the peasants. And so by the time they get there, he is already dead. So the peasant revolt then, they've overthrown the government. However, they don't really have the organization to sort of form their own government. In the meantime, during this upheaval, this gives the Manchus the opportunity to move in. And the Manchus from the north move in from Manchuria. They move in and they conquer Beijing, and they set up a new dynasty. This dynasty is known as the Qing dynasty. So, even though they were not the ones that technically got rid of the emperor, they were the ones who came in and set up a new government. The Qing dynasty, as you can see, is going to last for about 250 years, up till about World War I, 1911. And here is a photograph of a family. Now, what they bring with them, the Manchus, the Qing, will force their culture, their dress, their hairstyles, and so forth on the local population. So they put down the peasant rebellion. and they basically force the men to dress as Manchus. And in this photograph, you can see the man in the center here, the father. You can see his forehead is shaved. And in fact, in the back, he would have a very long ponytail. That was the style that he was forced to wear. And you see his children here, his sons actually, shaved heads with the small ponytails on the side. They also have shaved foreheads as they get older. And they had to wear the clothes, they had to have the hairstyle, all of this, braiding their hair and shaving their foreheads and so forth. The little saying went, you either lose your hair or you lose your head. This was part of the Qing or Manchu control, forcing them to dress and wear their hair and so forth in the style that they dictated. So here we see the boundaries of the Qing dynasty. Notice they are quite successful in controlling China and somewhat expanding China out into, say, Tibet, and of course up into Manchuria, which is where they're from, and Mongolia. So these outlying areas will come under Chinese control, pretty much as they are today, and then they still solidify control in the sort of heartland of China down here by the major rivers and the coastlines. But they will also extend their influence into Korea and into especially Vietnam and Southeast Asia. Now, the most important ruler, many would call him the greatest Chinese ruler probably of all time, is Kang Xi. Kang Xi rules for 6 decades as emperor of China. 6 decades, almost 60 years he's ruling. Anyway, he rules for a very long time, as you can see. He stabilizes the government. He kept the peace. He actually made the Qing dynasty acceptable. You know, Chinese people are not accepting of people who are not Chinese. They did not view Kang Xi and the Manchu as Chinese. They were outsiders. They were foreigners, or whatever you want to call it. They had come in and taken over China. But it's during his reign that the Chinese begin to accept this rule. And this is also the time when Christians are quite active during his reign, because he is rather tolerant of the Christians there. And in fact, hundreds of officials and approximately 300,000 others converted to Christianity. So we have hundreds of government officials and thousands upon thousands of Chinese people become Christians. Now this is interesting because it leads to some controversy. One of the controversies actually doesn't come between the emperor and the Christians, but it's between the missionaries who had been in China and new missionaries that come to China, and then also the Pope. So remember, we had said the Jesuits had allowed a lot of Confucius ideas, the teachings of Confucius, to be allowed. They also allowed for a lot of Confucian rituals. So here you see on the left it's maybe hard to make out, but it's actually, if you look at it closely, it is the life of Christ. This is Christ right here. And of course, then this is Mary, right? And then here come the wise men. Remember, the wise men came from the east, in this case, and they're depicted as being Chinese. And here's the stable, so forth, and the mountains nearby. So the setting of it is all Chinese, but it's the story of the birth of Christ. And this was part of the life of Christ, translated into Chinese and illustrated. And this is from 1637. Well, the Jesuits had been pretty lenient. Some would say lax, too lenient, too accommodating to the teachings of Confucius. And so when new missionaries show up, new monks show up, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, they are shocked by what they see. They are upset by what they see. And in fact, they go to the Pope. They send messages to the Pope, And they appeal to the Pope and they say, look, this is what's going on here in China. We don't know if you're aware of this, but we got here and this is what we found. When this is sent to the Pope basically makes a decision that what the Jesuits have been doing was wrong and that needed to stop. Now, okay, that's sort of a internal Roman Catholic dispute. But what makes this even more interesting, I think, is that the Emperor Kang Chi gets involved in this, and he writes a letter. He sends communication to the Pope and appeals to the Pope to allow the Chinese Christians to continue their Confucius practices along with Christianity. The Pope, of course, didn't accept that. But what I find interesting is that the Emperor felt the desire, he felt the need to try to intervene in this, to end or to cut off some conflict that might come. And it certainly does come after this because things become more strident with the Christians. And by the time we get to the next emperor, Yongzheng, he will begin to suppress the Christians. This is in the 18th century. And eventually persecution will even come to them. Well, Kuai Long, 1736 to 1795, a tolerant ruler. He keeps the frontier stable, and we see good growth during the 18th century under his reign. So then we come to, of course, the event that you might imagine is coming. More European involvement, especially the British. The British are coming to China, first to the southern part of China, to Canton. If you've had Cantonese Chinese food, that comes from the south. And that's British controlled this area starting in 1699. At first, the British merchants were licensed to work there and to carry out trade with the Chinese. Later, they pushed to be the only ones who could do this, an exclusive contract to take goods to the West. As they gained more influence, as China became weaker, the British became stronger, or maybe it's really the other way around. As the British become stronger, the Chinese government becomes weaker. And eventually, the guy pictured here, Lord Macartney, in 1793, wanted to set up a trade deal with the British, with the Chinese and the British. Part of the problem was the Chinese didn't really want any British stuff. The British didn't have anything that appealed to them. Of course, the Chinese had silk and tea and porcelain. These are all things that the British wanted. But the British didn't really have any goods that the Chinese wanted. They didn't want wool. They weren't that interested in British textiles, cotton and things. They had silk. They had their own textiles they thought were better. And so they wanted gold, silver. They wanted hard currency. So the British did not like that. They were not comfortable with a trade deficit. That is, where British gold and silver and so forth would be going to China, and then China would be giving them the goods. This meant the trade was sort of unbalanced as far as the British were concerned. The Chinese were not buying any British goods, but the British were buying a lot of Chinese goods. This sort of situation we find ourselves in today. We have a trade deficit with China today. This is part of what these recent embargoes and negotiations are all about, is the fact that China sells us a lot more stuff than they buy from us. And so there's a flow of currency out of the United States into China. Well, when Lord Macartney couldn't get the Chinese to agree to what he wanted, and that is for them to exchange goods, because the British wanted the silk, the porcelain, and the tea, it sets the stage for the British to actually increase their control. In other words, maybe if the Chinese went back in time, it might have been better off had they agreed to something here in 1793. Because just to give you a little preview of what's coming, is the British actually have to come up with a product, come up with something that the Chinese are going to want instead of cash. And that's going to be opium. Opium, because remember the British controlled India and Afghanistan areas. This is where most of the opium was coming from poppies and poppy seeds, and it could be then manufactured into opium. Once people got a hold of opium, they wanted a lot more of it. And pretty soon, the Chinese are giving out their cash, their gold, their silver to the British to fund this opium. And it'll even lead to a war, opium war. All right, we'll leave it there for now.